Welcome to Art and Scroll Studio. I'm Shelley Werner and the host of our Zoom series where we feature the makers and creators of Judaic arts. On Wednesday, March 15th, 2023, Heather Stoltz was a featured guest on Flight and Freedom. What follows is the full episode as it appeared on that day. Please subscribe to our channel so you'll be sure to know when we have episodes coming in the future or watch episodes that have happened in the past. Heather, I want to ask you this. All people who take flight hope to find an ideal world without the chains they left behind. Can you comment on how the ideals of our society are vulnerable today? And do you grapple with this in your art?
Yeah, definitely. I think people often, when they flee to a new place, are looking for safety and freedom. And then when they get to that new place, the question then becomes, whose freedoms are prioritized? And so that's something that I explore a lot in my work.
Heather, welcome. Thank you so much for being patient. And I'm excited to share your work as we get started with your concepts and how you approach leave-taking, our society, our culture. Why is the sky blue? What did you do? What is this about?
So this piece was made for a challenge of an art group that I was a part of. And for the challenges, they would throw out a phrase as your inspiration. So for this, it was, why is the sky blue? And I took that to mean, why is the sky sad? And to me, it must be sad and weeping over all of the headlines and all of the things that it sees happening on Earth. So on the bottom is kind of an abstract Earth with painted fabrics and printed headlines and images of what's happening. And so the sky is crying beads.
But here we have something that looks happy. There's a celebration after a journey. Tell us about Miriam and the journal.
Yeah, so Miriam is the Passover story, or the Exodus, where this is just after they've crossed the sea, and Miriam is leading the people in dance and in song. And so all of the people have been transformed into musical notes, and Miriam is the larger blue note that's leading them all. And the journal piece was during a time where I was doing a monthly piece where every month I would create a small art piece about what that month was. And so this one was done at the time when it was April and Passover, so we have the splitting of the Red Sea, but also it was a time of transition in my own life, and so kind of this parting of the waters and entering a new unknown.
So now we have something that is quite stunning and three-dimensional. And tell us about the whole world as a narrow bridge.
Yeah, this piece is inspired by the quote by Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, "The whole world is a narrow bridge, the key is not to fear." And so I've created this three-dimensional suspension bridge using fabric that has an antique map of the world printed on it. And so you would need to kind of cross this bridge, this rickety world, in order to get through. The key is not to fear. So that's why there are the tzitzit on the corners to remind us that even through this crazy journey, that God is with us.
Now, I believe this is the piece you have in the show that Ruth has a piece in as well. Tell us about what your thoughts were in mending our country.
Yeah, I started creating this piece after the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And I started just creating the frayed flag because, in all honesty, I had lost complete faith in democracy in the United States and didn't think that democracy would continue in the country for much longer, if at all. But then there was a peaceful transfer of power. And so I started making these purple people helping each other stitch the flag back together.
I see here that you have a commentary on whether there really is freedom after all.
Yes, so this piece is about immigration, especially in the southern border into the United States. And these people are kind of standing at the border behind this flag, wondering, is this the land of the free? Will they be admitted?
Now, this temporary shelter is something that inspired you. I believe you even put a book together about this. Tell me
Yes.
what were some of your thoughts in creating this?
So at the time, I was working as the ritual coordinator for a Reform synagogue on the Upper West Side, and they had a shelter where several men would sleep in their basement. And getting to know those men, I wanted to get their stories shared with the world. And so their stories took the form of this sukkah, that's temporary dwelling, where the individual stories of people that I met in faith-based shelters are on the inside panels, and the outside is made up of individual squares that were made by children living in family shelters in New York City.
I love this quote here. It's very interesting, puts in perspective the priorities that we must have in our culture and in our society. Now, you did some workshops with this. Did you do these workshops with children living in shelters?
Yes, I traveled to 5 different family shelters around New York, mostly in Queens and in the Bronx. And in each one, I led a workshop with the children, whoever wanted to participate. And I asked them to create a piece that represented how they felt about living in the shelter. And there were more than 100 pieces that were all sewn together that created the outside of the temporary shelter piece.
Very interesting and very powerful images. Sometimes less is more. Tell us about the dark days.
This is one of the pieces that I've created in response to school shootings. So this one I made 3 years after the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary. And each of the triangles that move up the center of the piece represents one of the people that was killed that day at Sandy Hook. And each of the Korea ribbons, the mourning ribbons, represents one school shooting that occurred in the 3 years from Sandy Hook to the time that I made the piece. And on each of those ribbons, in yellow pencil, I very lightly wrote the name of the school and the date.
So I know that Sandy Hook has played a role in several of your pieces, and particularly in this one. Tell us what happened 10 years after.
Yeah, so this piece I just made this year, 10 years after the Sandy Hook shooting. And I was thinking about how the children who had been 6 and 7 years old at the time of the shooting should be 16 and 17. They should be getting their driver's license and driving, but instead they had been killed at a time when they were playing with toy cars. So for each of the 20 children that were killed, I have a small toy car that represents that individual, and the 6 red lines with stitching represent the 6 adults that were killed trying to keep them safe. And the hand stitching of those red lines, there are 1,000 stitches that represent the 1,000 school shootings that have happened in those 10 years.
Very powerful piece. The toy cars are really poignant. The sense of and there's a sense of that they're stuck, like in aspic, they're frozen.
Right. It also brings us back to what we were talking about with freedom and whose freedoms are prioritized.
Right. And as you and I have discussed before, the flip side of freedom is the dark side, where if you have freedom to be, you have also freedom to destroy.
Exactly.
And so that brings us to bringing light into the darkness. What kind of light and who's bringing it?
Yeah, this piece was created shortly after Trump was elected as president, and there were several exhibitions that were done around the country at the time. This one was created for an exhibition called Nasty Women. And so in response to all of the kind of hate and intolerance that was going on around us, what I wanted to do was hide in a corner, but realized a better response was to try to bring light back into that dark world.
Now you're moving from the societal picture to a more personal sense of there's freedom in the world, but what if it's taken away?
Exactly. This is from a series that I just finished about women's pandemic stories. So I interviewed several women about what their lives were like, especially in those early years during the pandemic, and what happens when we don't have the freedom to go about our lives. So these two pieces were both about two grandmothers living in a YWCA residence, and one felt really confined and lonely, as the title is. She really longed to be with her family, and so you can see her kind of pressing against the walls, hoping to get to her family. And the other woman that I interviewed was in the exact same situation, but responded very differently, where she was content to be alone and making her diamond paintings while her family went about their business.
I have a feeling that this has something to do with a crazy world. Tell me
Yes.
what's this figure doing?
This is another from that pandemic series. This is a woman who was working for an organization that helps immigrants. And so she was working very hard to help people living in small apartments get what they needed, helping them to get computer skills so that they could get their children online. And at the same time, her husband lost his job and they needed assistance getting food of their own and trying to put food on the table. And so she is clinging to these ropes, just trying to hold on.
Now, here we're seeing, and this is always fascinating to me, is to see the artist's technique and how it is that you build up your ideas and your concepts. So, what am I looking at here in the sketchbook?
Sure. I usually start from a sketch. So after I interviewed the women for this, I started with sketches, and sometimes the pieces very closely resembled those sketches. And sometimes I went through several sketches before I found one that was going to work. But this is a piece about a woman who is a small business owner and a mother, and her life was very highly organized. So that's the top part where it's the calendar with every minute of every day is perfectly square. And then everything closed down. And so she's tangled in this lost time until she and her son found some kind of pattern of their own to create a new schedule for themselves. But this one is full of holes and changes and last minute craziness.
So, a new world order was
Exactly.
created. And I think so many of us can relate to that because our lives now don't look anything like this. And at the time that they did, we thought it would never change. We didn't think this was precarious. We thought this was so hard edged. And
Right.
now,
What could possibly happen?
yeah, how could that go wrong? So now we're seeing in your sketchbook something that you've worked on, and I see your notes here. Is that a big part of your process?
Definitely. So in the sketchbook, I create the sketch with the image, but also lots of notes about where texture should be or where color should be or where text should be, things like that.
And what is this? What is the clergy's burden? What is it?
This is a piece about a reverend who talked a lot about taking on her parishioners' burdens. She felt like they were coming to her with all of these burdens and they wanted her to make meaning out of it. And there wasn't really much meaning to be had at the time. It was just scary and there was so much grief. So this is her taking on those boulders with some of the words that her parishioners came to her with. And in the yellow part is her meaning making, where she quotes some of the Psalms to them.
Before we go into this one, I just want to remind people to please pose your questions in the chat so that I can pose them to Heather and Ruth in a very short little while. So what's happening here? I see that there are some layers being pulled away. That's what I'm reading here. What is happening?
Exactly. So this is a piece that I made for an interfaith exhibit where when we first meet people, especially people of different backgrounds, there's a tendency to put up a lot of walls. And so it's the peeling back of those layers and letting our guard down in order to truly meet each other and learn about each other.
And you can certainly see that. What is the mesh? Is that actually mesh that I'm looking at?
Yeah, the top layer is actually metal. It's fencing. And then the layers behind it are a shear tool with some wire in it to keep its shape.
Very powerful piece. How big is this?
This is, I believe, about 3 feet by 2 feet.
It's hard to see that scale, but that is pretty large. So I can see that you have a concept of a talit here. What is the story behind it?
This piece was made when my children were pretty young. I think they were about 1 and 3 at the time. And before having kids, my connection to Judaism had a lot to do with communal prayer. And so with young kids, that becomes very difficult. And I felt like I wasn't able to have that same connection to Judaism, and felt that connection kind of fraying and falling away. And so I have this image of the person holding onto the tzitzit, trying to hang by a thread to what's left of that connection to Judaism.
It's very powerful. Did you actually start from a talit?
I did not. I created half of a talit.
So these are two very powerful images. They are they a suite? Do they go together?
Yeah, this is from a series about parenthood. And so in the piece on the left, it's about the instinct that parents often have to protect our children from the world, and to protect them from all of the things, even knowing about all of the things that are going on around us, like natural disasters and disease, all of those things that we don't want to harm our children. But we also have a responsibility to teach them and to face that darkness, and to teach them ways to face the world with kindness and with empathy and with bravery.
So when you embark in a piece like this, do you actually have these pieces of fabric, and then where does the inspiration come from? You look at the fabric and you go, this would be a good story to tell, as it looks like the cosmos, it looks like the world, the one on the right. And the one on the left looks like it's behind some tulle or some translucent fabric. Tell me, does your inspiration come from the fabric or from the idea?
Usually it comes from the idea, and I create a sketch, and then I have a really hard time finding the fabric to match. So then I go searching to create something, and sometimes I have to make fabrics myself if I can't find what I'm looking for. The piece on the left it's mostly white on the background, and then there are layers of tulle over that.
Interestingly enough, there's a recall here of Ruth's approach, which is looking through time. And you have that sense of a window through time here. And I think that the world that is threatening the family is a sense of continuity there, that it's going on and on. And here that looks like there's bravery and boldness. So you've definitely accomplished that.
Right. It also brings us back to our question of freedom.
Right.
And, as a person who is in a place of some privilege, we have the freedom to keep things from our children for a certain amount of time. And I walk through the world knowing that that is a privilege and a freedom that we have, and not all parents have that.
Beautiful. Now, where are you going here? Looks like you're trying to escape.
Yes. This piece was made during COVID and during the lockdown. And there were just so many problems in the world. It felt like really the only solution was to leave the planet entirely. So this is the piece that I made.
And this is your last image that we're going to share. And it's a very powerful quotation that I'm very fond of, that you are not permitted to desist from finishing your work. Tell me what these people are doing and how does it inspire you?
So as tempting as it is to just leave the world and say there is nothing we can do to fix it, it's our responsibility to at least do some part. That's what this piece is about. So we have these 3 figures coming together to help mend part of the world, this broken landscape. They can't fix the whole world, but it's their job to do what they can.
Very beautiful. I can see they're having some success.
Some.